Welcome back to Across the Pond. We are back this time with an evening edition. Everything tried to stop us today. I had to battle through hordes of football fans on the tube. Barry has had to change his location because of Eskom and its load shedding woes. And of course, my favorite friends upstairs with their kids that are trotting around. We are not going to be stopped. We are here. It's Across the Pond and it's episode 5. Across the Pond with Barry and Chad. So welcome back to Across the Pond. As I said, Barry is joining us from Johannesburg as always, except this time from a different location. He has had to change his normal film location to facilitate this podcast as a result of Eskom's load shedding. Welcome, Barry.
Thank you. It's good to be here. Yeah, Eskom decided we needed a change of setting. So for our YouTube viewers, I hope you're enjoying the new background. I had to race across here to my parents' place, and I'm borrowing their place for this podcast because, as you say, the show must go on. The podcast must go on.
At all costs, absolutely. Let's get into it. It's gonna be a busy one.
The week that was.
Right, the week that was, as I said, quite a busy one. I know our last 2 episodes have been long. This one is not going to be any different. We'll try to keep it short and sweet, though. This last weekend, following from a lot of South African news. If you just joined the podcast, this is a global podcast, but we are definitely focused on the two opposites of the pond to which we sit, South Africa and England. I'm in London and Barry's in Johannesburg. So yeah, this last week, the Competition Commission in South Africa making a ruling that the data prices in South Africa must fall 30 to 50% in the next 2 months. Quite a bold statement that. It's not a blanket decrease in the data bundle rate. It's actually trying to kind of fix the disparity between the smaller bundle offerings and the bigger ones. Barry, what's your take on this?
It's about time. In South Africa, we've been struggling with very high data costs for a long time now. And it's very clearly a very good thing to do for business, right? It's very clearly the right thing to do in this kind of country, especially in the kind of economic environment that we have, in order to unlock that development and unlock a lot of the potential that comes with cheap data. But as you say, because the major players in the market have had such a monopoly and have such control over it, they've been able to name whatever their price is. And so it really is about time. It's legislation that's been in process for a long time now. A lot of people have been talking about it, and it's good to see things finally happening.
I mean, as you said, I think about time is definitely going to be the sentiment of a lot of South African users. But in terms of the stock exchange shareholders of Vodacom and MTN being the two cellular players that really represent the bulk of the market, them not being very happy about this decision. Quite a tough one, I believe, because there's a couple of other things at play here. So, yes, let's quickly just go back to basics. So, I believe that the disparity between the small bundle offerings and the big bundle offerings are sometimes 50-fold, which I think is quite significant. So, first, if we avoid the discussion of South African rates versus international, which we'll get to now, that disparity in itself, I think, is quite telling. And this certainly having an effect on the poor. And having an effect on those who can't afford those big bundles.
Yeah, definitely. And not only that, but the bundles are so out of whack that you often find out that even if you can afford the bigger bundles and you pay those extra prices, all of a sudden you get to the end of your 30 days and that all of that data expires. And so it's very strange for like a digital asset like this, which theoretically shouldn't have a limit, it shouldn't have an expiry date because it's simply numbers in a spreadsheet. These companies have been putting artificial limits and artificial kind of pricing structures in place that don't really make sense. And so it's something that I think has been coming for a long time, and they've been getting away with it for a long time. And obviously now that they've faced the music, they're obviously not very happy about it because they've been making a lot of money and a lot of their profits are coming from data. We've seen a huge shift in those companies away from revenue from telephone calls and from SMSs and those kinds of things, and the majority of the revenue is shifting to data in this new world. And so it's obviously going to be a big shock for these big players, but from a consumer perspective and from an economic perspective, it makes all the sense in the world.
I mean, as you say, being somebody on the ground, I think it's really hard to see how some of these data costs in South Africa compare to the rest of the world. So let's delve into that a little bit. I've heard one of these basically conversations between, quite a prevalent market commentator in this space. And he brought up the issue of spectrum. So spectrum, as far as I understand, being something to do with the broadband, obviously to try and avoid having just two big players in the economy. Basically, the South African government has got involved in some way and started regulating this spectrum. So everyone is allotted a certain amount of bandwidth, from what I understand, and of course Vodacom and MTN, being the two biggest, have a limited amount of this bandwidth. Now, one of the reasons why they justify this price being so high is that they aren't able to get their spectrum, so they have to refarm it. In other words, meaning buying that spectrum from another player at a markup rate. Now, do you think this is a justifiable reason for the massive difference in rates of South African data versus internationally? Or do you think this is just trying to find an excuse?
I think there's a little bit of truth there. I think there's a little bit of truth because from my discussions and the conversations I've had around this topic, I do know the South African spectrum is a little bit wonky in the sense that when it was set up like decades ago and they were allotting the various pieces of the spectrum to various providers, they weren't thinking far enough ahead and they probably weren't able to predict what the system would look like today. And so the infrastructure in place is maybe not set up perfectly for a 21st century world or for a 2019 world. And so I'm sure there is some truth to the fact that the spectrum is a bit messed up, and because these companies have to operate in their little lane, as far as I understand it, there are some constraints there. However, we are moving in towards a 4G, 5G world, which is opening up more parts of the spectrum. And so I'm assuming that these constraints are going to become non-existent over time, and as we open up more opportunities for communication, I think it should become a non-issue, but I don't know enough about the technicalities to know how soon that's going to be. That being said, I'm sure they also are over-exaggerating it as well to try and push their point, so I can see both sides. What do you think, Chad?
Absolutely. I definitely agree with you. I think there is a little bit of truth there, and it's quite a tough one when, from the one side, the Competition Commission is saying, hey, we need more competition, ultimately, let's regulate your spectrum. And on the other side, they're saying, well, now we actually need to limit your data prices as well. And for the two companies that are really holding the bulk of the CapEx budget in terms of South African infrastructure, in terms of data networks, I believe each of them spend around 10 billion rand a year on capex each. I definitely see their side of the story as well, but certainly something needs to be done to bring down the data prices in South Africa. I know after moving over to London, the value you unlock here is definitely inconceivable to anyone sitting that side in South Africa. So I think it'll be interesting to see what happens here. And let's see in the next 2 months whether there'll be any real change made, or if this is going to be held up in courts for some time. So let's move on to the next one. This one is basically an announcement coming out from Deliveroo. Deliveroo being the essentially Mr. Delivery, what you would call in South Africa. This is one of those apps that has really revolutionized how takeaways works in London. The bulk of their workers go around the city on bicycles or scooters. They've been in the press for a while, actually, just in terms of employment legislation, and not seeing those bicycle workers as contractors, but actually having to take a bit of responsibility for these guys as employees. But let's not look at that. They were basically slapped on the wrist this week with an advert that has been dismissed by the advertising authority for being misleading. Have you seen anything about this?
I haven't. I saw you put it on the list, and so I'm excited to find out what they've been doing, because these delivery companies have become one of my guilty pleasures when I'm feeling lazy and I want food delivered to my room, to my door. What happened in this ad, and why did they pull it down, Chad?
So it's quite an interesting one. I actually, by the way, work in the same building as Deliveroo, so I found this really interesting. And just being one of those workplaces that, as you say, one of those apps that just revolutionized the way these takeaway things work. So essentially the ad is a mother walking into a house with a big delivery bag, and essentially dishing out meals from different providers in the same bag. Now, if you ever use Deliveroo as an app, there is a bit of a limited functionality in that you can only place one order at one provider per time, and each delivery incurs its own delivery fee. Now, the makers of this advert obviously knew this, and instead, to kind of make it seem transparent, they put in small text at the bottom, graphical restrictions apply, separate orders must be made for each restaurant. advertising authorities saying that's not good enough. They've received 300 complaints for people who have used the app and know that that is not its functionality. So yeah, basically just a misleading advert, I would say.
It's amazing what these companies have to do, especially in a space like this, which is very crowded. It's very hard to differentiate yourself, right? At the end of the day, the service is the same from all providers, and you're competing on price, you're competing on brand, and this is obviously a way where they just try to sneak a little differentiation into the mix. But unfortunately, they were caught out. I don't know how companies think they can get away with this in today's age. Like maybe 10, 15 years ago, you might have been able to get away with this kind of thing. But with the internet trolls and with people being so skeptical and so like nitpicky about things, I mean, it's just silly.
100%. I mean, I definitely thought it was a funny one, and yeah, not missing our radar, certainly with all of the ethics breaches we've seen on our previous episodes. So let's move on to a bit more of a macro level. This one being up on everyone's radar, really. Trump and the potential impeachment. A bit of development on that one today. There are, basically 2 articles released of impeachment, one being abuse of power and the second obstruction of Congress. Now, I've also just read a couple of mixed things. I'm not too deep on the subject matter of this one, but essentially, Trump trying to get involved in hacking the election, if you'd like, trying to get Ukraine... Allegedly. Sorry, let's start this again. Trump allegedly trying to basically fix the election, or at least have some sort of influence on the election by looking elsewhere in the world with Ukraine, and actually using his post to offer them 2 sweeteners for this potential favor that he's asked. So obviously we've seen in his last election a lot of alleged scandals with the data analytica and all of that type of thing. Quite interesting that basically Congress has taken quite a hard stance on this, and they're moving forward with this.
Yeah, it's been one of those things been brewing for a long time. I think even the moment that Trump got elected, the opposition party was so distraught and so angry with it that they were looking for any excuse. And then when all of this thing came up with the political interference through Russia and through Cambridge Analytica and all those kind of parties, and they started to unravel some of the stories in this, it became more and more likely that they were going to try and impeach Trump. The problem with this is that it's so muddy and it's so like no one actually knows what's going on. So as far as I understand, they had a few committees that put this report together and now have unveiled these reports and these kinds of articles of impeachment. And as far as I understand, they're going to go through the next 2 weeks of discussion and debate to try and figure out like is it impeachable or not, and then make a decision based on that. But with the nature of the bipartisan kind of fighting across the aisle over the last year or two, it's really hard to know whether this actually comes from a genuine objective place or it's simply politics at its best. And so it's going to be interesting to watch to see what happens. I think that we speak so much about Trump. He just dominates global headlines all of the time. This is yet another example of just how he dominates global headlines, and for good or for bad, he really is a character that's going to go down in history as one of the most, I don't know what adjective to use, one of the most interesting US presidents. Whether he gets impeached or not, I know he's going to have a lot to say about it. And so I'm interested to see what comes out of his mouth in the next couple of weeks. And if it does get more serious, if he does look to get impeached, he's not going to go down without a fight. So you're going to see some serious fireworks there in the US.
Definitely. I mean, I think the last bit of this one, the second article being that obstruction of Congress, has really played well into the hands of those who are bringing about this action, where they are trying to get access to this information, and he has actually obstructed them, which is why this second article has been brought about. So let's have a look to see if anything meaningful happens there, or as you say, if it's a typical case of politics again.
What's also interesting that I wanted to bring up was I was listening to a podcast earlier today about with a guy called Gary Kasparov, who was an old chess master back in the day, and now he works on human rights, and it speaks a lot about Russia-US interrelations. And he was chatting about how Trump has become this amazing puppet for Vladimir Putin because he Putin could just sit back and just relax and watch the chaos unfold in America, which is exactly what Russia wants. And so he must be sitting at home right now, absolutely loving this, absolutely loving all the chaos, loving the fact that America are tearing themselves apart because they can't agree on a leader or a way forward for the country. It really is dark times for America, and we have to see what democracy happens and what transpires from this.
Indeed, we'll keep our eyes peeled and see what happens there. In terms of this next one, Barry, I'd let you introduce this one of our favorite companies, Google.
Yeah, so Google, of course, is the big behemoth. It is the company that controls everything. And if we look back at like our generation, I would argue it's probably the strongest company we've ever seen formed, right from the beginning, from just a lowly search engine to this giant company today that's now known as Alphabet, which is the holding company of all of their subsidiaries. And it's really been a huge success story, and it's kind of kickstarted the tech revolution in the world. And this week, there was a very interesting thing that happened. The two co-founders, the two old honchos, the guys who were there right from the very beginning, Larry Page and Sergey Brin, have stepped down from Alphabet and are now going to stay in a board capacity, but not in a day-to-day running of the business. So this change is mostly cosmetic because these two guys actually stepped away from most of the day-to-day stuff a while ago with the new CEO that was installed a few years ago. And so this is simply a move from their part to kind of move into the next chapter of their life. And I think it's a huge thing to step away from a baby like that you've built over the last 20 years and has become so globally influential. And so for them stepping down, it must have been a hell of a difficult decision, and it's going to certainly change the way that Google looks at itself. If we look at the way that Apple struggled after Steve Jobs left and they try to redefine their identity and redefine why they exist and what they're trying to do, Google and Alphabet are going to have to do the same thing. And so it's been interesting to see what happens with the new management that gets put in place, and see what kind of involvement these guys have as they've stepped out of the limelight per se and start to look forward as to what they're going to do next in their careers.
Yeah, I actually missed this group restructuring, and it actually basically came to my attention when I clicked on the link that you had in our shared doc. But yeah, basically, the reasoning I found really funny, and obviously not just to kind of strip away from the serious bits, where Alphabet, the holding company, was established to have obviously Google as the main bet, but the others as their other bets, which I thought quite a clever way of coming to that name. But yeah, I mean, just in terms of redefining their identity and all that kind of thing, this current CEO has seen profits soar under his reign, and certainly I think the stock market definitely reacting positively. I think the basically the share prices went up by I think 5%. I may be off on that, but yeah, I mean, certainly you're going to have to, as you say, decide on how the identity changes from here. But I mean, obviously, this seems to be a very capable CEO, and I think as the two co-founders have detailed it in this particular article, Google has grown to be what they call sort of 21-year-old adult, and it's now time to leave the nest, as they put it. So this, in their mind, seems to be the natural move of progression for the company, and it'll certainly be interesting to see what happens next for Google.
Yeah, so one more thing I wanted to add is that I think this is going to be a pivot point for Google. I kind of see Google's business model as being under serious threat right now because of this, a lot of the privacy concerns, a lot of the looking at advertising and how that's impacting media and how it's impacting our thoughts and how we'd make our decisions. And so Google in its current form is going to have to change over the next 10 or 20 years. And also as it starts to get labeled as a monopoly and starts to get increasing pressure from regulators, the current CEO is going to have to figure out how do you make Google the next survive as the giant behemoth for the next 10, 20, 50 years. And so I think we're going to look back at this point in time, like you say, it's now 21, it's now coming into, it has to be an adult now and has to really get into the world and really show what it's worth. It's going to have to adapt and pivot, and I think Google has done very well in the past at doing that, but it's going to have to continue to do that as there's increasing pressure from regulators, from governments, and from the public. So I think it's an interesting time. I think we're going to look back on this day as an interesting pivot moment in the company. Is it going to go the way of Kodak? Is it going to struggle to adapt its business model and move into the new world? Or is it going to find a new way to reinvent itself once again and remain the huge influential company that it is?
Yeah, so I mean that's certainly going to be interesting to see, and yeah, just great that we are part of history, and we'll look back at this point in time, and yeah, let's see what happens with them. So let's move on to our next one, stuff I found interesting.
Stuff I found interesting.
Right, so the first one on this list is, as we touched on in the intro, the reason why Barry is at an alternate recording location today, load shedding being still a thing in South Africa. Now, this is quite a surprise to me. Obviously, I left there, when load shedding was a thing that had, taken up a lot of frustration in a lot of the time that I was there, and there was certainly a 5-year gap in load shedding, and it seems to now be back better than ever. Barry, talk us through it.
Yeah, so I think it's worth explaining what load shedding is, because I know that it's a very South African term, and I remember having a conversation with a friend of mine in the US when I was there about a month ago now, and I mentioned load shedding, and he had no idea what I was talking about. So let me explain what it is. Basically, Eskom is the giant power operator here in South Africa, and they operate all of the power grids. And they've had a lot of issues with maintenance on their projects and maintenance on their sites and things going wrong in the power grid. And that's resulted in rolling blackouts where they have switched off huge parts of the country's electricity to try and manage the load so that they don't have a complete blackout. And so what load shedding is they'll take certain parts of suburbs and they will turn off their electricity for 4 to 6 hours at a time during every single day in a lot of cases, and really cause a lot of havoc in the cities. Because what you don't realize until you have no power is how reliant you are on power, how reliant you are for Wi-Fi and for robots to work and for shops to run their business and for all sorts of things. And when you don't have it, all of a sudden you realize, oh wait, it's actually super, super important. And it's the kind of problem we shouldn't be having in 2019. Like, we should have solved the power issue by now. Electricity should be widely available and should be available at all times. And so to go through this kind of period once again, like you say, it's been a while since we had this. But in the last week or two, we've gone back into load shedding. And so, for example, yesterday I had 6 hours of my day where I had no power whatsoever in my house. And so it's getting, I think, in the last couple of days, it went to what's called stage 6, which is the highest it's ever been to. And what that means is that basically you're getting 6 to 8 hours every single day, no matter where you are in the country. Luckily, tonight it's back down to level 2, but once again, when I was due to record this podcast in my own house, unfortunately, Eskom decided the other that we have to move. And so load shedding itself is very bad for the South African economy. It really is damaging for the reputation and for the morale of the country. You just kind of feel the morale kind of drip down when something like this happens. And so it's tough to deal with, and it feels like a problem we should have solved already.
Yeah, I mean, it's really a tough one when you have to say you're lucky to have stage 2. Stage 2 still being quite a bit of downtime. So, yeah, as you say, significant effects on the working world, on people, just running their day-to-day lives. Not good for traffic. So anyone out and about on the roads is really hating this. And yeah, I mean, lots of businesses resort to having generators, which they pay a big premium on electricity for fuel and diesel and that kind of thing. And as you say, in 2019, why is this still a thing? My thing is, how do you go from stage 0 to stage 6 in a couple of weeks? Surely, well, I mean, I did see something about an excessive rainfall coming about at one of the plants. One of the articles I saw, basically a statement being released from Eskom's chairperson and acting CEO, Jabu Mabuza, essentially just saying that he doesn't think they're failing. That's quite an interesting one for me. Clearly, there hasn't been any maintenance done at this plant, and as significant as this rainfall could be, should it result in going from stage 0 to stage 6?
Yeah, I think one of the key problems that always gets unraveled when we have this load shedding is that we are too reliant on major power plants for our national grid, right? We don't have enough diversified power generators or power plants. And so what happens is when you have a big plant like Medupi that goes down or has maintenance that doesn't go right or rain or whatever the story is, if it takes out one of the big major plants, it has a huge impact on the capacity of South Africa to generate its own electricity. And so we don't have enough diversification. The regulation hasn't opened up enough doors for alternative uses for solar and those kinds of power generators. If you want to generate your own power, it's very, very challenging from a regulation perspective. And so I think personally that South Africa is way too reliant on these 3 or 4 major power plants where if one goes down,
Yeah.
which sometimes happens, you're in big trouble. And that's why we see this rapid expansion from a stage 0 to a stage 6 in no time, because if a big plant goes down, we lose a significant portion of our capacity.
Yeah, definitely. So, I mean, as you say, being quite reliant on a small number of plants, but I think most importantly here, being reliant on one provider. So obviously in the UK, I may be wrong here, but I've just done a quick Google and something came up there to compare 86 energy suppliers. There are, it's a free market way of doing it, and I haven't had one day of no electricity. Very competitive, everyone kind of advertises their rates quite openly. You could even lock in your rates for a period of time. As I said, so basically when I moved into this place, I did a 2020 plan. So essentially up till 2020, the rates are fixed. And by that, I've actually avoided 2 price increases. So yeah, definitely benefits of a free market economy. And I mean, the increase in calls to get the national regulator split up a bit.
Definitely. And that's kind of the murmurs throughout the country and the murmurs throughout the business world as well, is that when is this going to be privatized and when is it going to be opened up to competition, right? As you say, if one company has a monopoly and they don't have the accountability to have to run efficiently, they can make mistakes. They don't have the social pressure of knowing that they have competition in their midst. And so this is such an important piece of South Africa, such an important piece of the economy. And so there's a lot of calls for it to be privatized and kind of split up. There are a lot of complications with that, so it's not an easy task, it's not an easy route to go. But like you say, that's the fairest way to open it up and actually fight for the best service, the best reliability to avoid these kinds of situations. South Africa can't expect to become a developed country and kind of continue to lead the African continent if we can't keep our lights on. It's a simple foundational thing that needs to feed the economy. And before we can get to any other fancy stuff, we need to fix that as well.
Back to basics. So on this theme and, kind of just the natural theme of progression, really, I saw this last week up on one of my social media platforms, the essentially movement of something called #I'mStaying. And I want to kick this one off with a very funny tweet that I saw by lead singer and, as far as I know, trumpeter of a band called The Kiffness. Which is the 6 stages of I'm staying. Stage 1, denial. Stage 2, denial. Stage 3, denial. Stage 4, denial. Stage 5, denial. Stage 6, #I'm leaving. So yeah, basically this movement, from what I can see, is essentially a bunch of people getting together, a whole bunch of South Africans trying to invoke a bit of positivity, a bit of hope, and really the trying to kind of get the ideals going, and yeah, rallying behind each other to stay in the country. The fact that this movement was created for me obviously invokes the fact that a lot of people are leaving. Me being one of them, and I'd probably say about 60% of my close friend group having also moved over in the last 2 years. So, being there still in South Africa, what is the I'm staying movement all about? Is it genuine, or is it really just a bunch of people trying to kind of, feel better about everyone else leaving?
Yeah, so it's a topic that is difficult to broach, and it's a difficult one because it has a lot of other connotations and undertones that are socially and politically challenging in South Africa. As far as I understand, the nexus of it lives on a Facebook group. So the Facebook group is kind of the home for it. And like you say, it's a place for people to post good news about South Africa or kind of encouraging messages about why they are staying in the country. And the reason, like you say, is that we continue to have a huge brain drain where a lot of our young, top talented people are leaving the country for greener pastures, either in the UK, in the US, Australia, Asia, etc. And so this is a kind of a pushback against that, trying to encourage people to stay in the country and work on some of the things that South Africa are struggling with. The intention of the group, I think, comes from a good place. I think that the intention is from a good place. It's an understanding of we want to fight for South Africa. We are South Africans. We don't want to leave. We want to stay and actually help make this country better. But what happens in these kind of mass social media movements, and we've seen it in thousands of other occasions, is it becomes a means of rationalizing things to yourself without actually doing anything. right? And so my kind of personal feelings on it was that
100%.
when I see those posts is that what I see people complaining. I see people rationalizing to themselves why they're staying, trying to make themselves a hero for staying, and they're not a hero for staying, right? Everyone's life circumstances are so different, and so you can't judge one person because they
100%.
left versus they stayed. And what it does is it gives them the kind of the impression that they're doing something. It gives them that little like tick of dopamine that says, I did my part today. I posted my Facebook post. I liked that tweet, whatever I did. And that gives me the feeling that I've done something for South Africa. But yes, South Africa, the real South Africa, is unchanged. And so it really frustrates me because I am a passionate South African. I want to be here and I want to help it grow this country. And so I'm trying to take action in the real world to do it. Again, social media is not action, right? We've got this really mixed up because we've seen so much activism and so many like revolutions started through social media. For example, the Egypt uprising and various examples around the world. We've seen great examples of social media which kind of catalyzes movements and catalyzes revolutions. But that's what it does. It catalyzes it. It doesn't actually do the revolution. It doesn't actually implement it, right? And so a group like I'm Staying, while the intention, I think, is good, and I agree with the message, but the way it's implemented and the fact that people are just on there every day rationalizing the decision to themselves that they're staying in the country for some moral reason, but in their own personal time, all they care about is themselves, and they don't do any work to actually push South Africa forward. And so those are kind of my thoughts. I'd be curious to know from your side, Chad, because obviously you were South African and now you're in London. What is the feeling from South Africans on that side for this kind of debate?
I haven't actually broached the subject anywhere, but I certainly will be. I think it's interesting. I think you articulated it very well there in terms of it being for people rationalizing their decision and kind of getting that moral high ground for, choosing to stay and really, as you say, feeling like they deserve some sort of pat on the back for saying they're staying. And I think I read a very interesting article written by a guy by the name of Andile Zulu, him having a personal blog. Basically he's sort of detailed that as good as the intention of this movement may be, it fails to bring any significant action, which is what you mentioned as well. And instead, all it does is instills hope and idealism. And, South Africa's had this in the past. He explains how, pictures of the past, like Cyril Ramaphosa being this big change that was going to, do so much for the country has really failed, and various other examples as well. And so I think it's an interesting article. I certainly would go and read it if you curious to find out about what's happening in South Africa and essentially the sentiment there. I definitely do salute you for being there on the ground and really wanting to do that change. And certainly on Barry's part, I know it's not really just a pat in the back, and he's really there for dramatic change. I definitely salute you on that front. But as you say, somebody who has left for whatever reason is kind of looked at in a negative light. And I definitely think if, as you say, back to basics, get everything right, and then let's talk about how we did everything so well, rather than just trying to be positive and ultimately corruption in government and poverty everywhere around the country, crime being a massive thing, low electricity, etc., the list goes on. That ultimately not having changed. So I completely agree with you there.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's too much talk and not enough action, right? One of my biggest frustrations, one of my biggest pet peeves with people here in South Africa, especially my white friends, to be honest, is that there's a lot of complaining, a lot of looking down on South Africa and looking down on the problems that we're facing and talking like rubbish about our country, and there's not enough actual action of saying, cool, if I complain about this thing, how can I make it better in my own way? How can I work with organizations that are trying to make this better? And obviously I understand that one person's not going to change the world, right? One person's not going to turn everything on its head. But if all of the young people in South Africa who actually cared about the country actually just took a few steps of action, got away from Facebook groups, and just got out to the community and met someone who's different than them, all right? Or go to help in an underprivileged community, or try and build a business that's serving a particular need in the community. That kind of action is much more valuable and is what South Africa needs, less so than talk. South Africans love talking, and they love shouting at each other and writing comments and all this kind of stuff. And if they just use a little bit of that energy in the real world, so outside of Facebook in the real South Africa, that's when change comes. And if you're not going to be willing to fight for that change, if you're not going to actually work for that change, change, then don't complain, right? Don't complain, and also don't try and get a pat on the head for sticking around even though you're not doing anything. That I'm gonna get off my soapbox now.
100%. Yeah, absolutely, completely agree on that one. And yeah, I mean, I think it's a good movement. But yeah, let's see if any real change happens there. Barry, I'm going to let you go through the next one, an interesting novel.
Yes. So again, I brought the prop. So let's show it to the YouTube subscribers over there.
Oh, fantastic.
It's a book by the name of It's called Eleanor Oliphant is Completely Fine. And it's a novel by a writer from Scotland called Gail Honeyman. And what I found amazing was that this is her debut novel, and she is just turned 40 years old. So she was working in admin behind a desk for her whole career, got to the age of 40, realized that she didn't actually want to be doing what she was doing, quit her job with basically no plan other than to write this book, wrote this book, and has had huge success out of nowhere with it. And so it's a really, really cool story. And putting her own personal story aside, the book is incredible. This is one of the best fiction novels I've read in a long time. It's not the kind of book I normally read. I was looking for a lighter read, and this is a very light, easy to read story. It really goes very quickly. I read it in about 2 days, but it's such a beautiful story. And what the story focuses on is this lady called Eleanor Oliphant, and it's a story about loneliness. That's the whole book is about loneliness, and it follows her life. And it's interesting because you can kind of see the author's life in Eleanor's life, right? Because Eleanor is this 40-year-old who's working at a graphic design agency and doing desk work and going home every weekend, doesn't have many friends, doesn't have a partner, is living this very, very lonely life, even though she's surrounded by people all the time. And it's a fantastic exposition of what does the anxiety and loneliness that millennials are feeling in this world these days, and how a lot of the fact that even though we're more connected than ever, we have more Facebook friends than ever, we are surrounded by people all the time, there's this tendency to isolate ourselves, and this tendency to kind of live our lives in silos and not interact with real humans in real time at depth. Or with depth at least. And so it's a fantastic story, and it hits all of these points without kind of pushing in your face. It just lets you live through the story of this woman, and you watch as she kind of grows in confidence and grows in her life and actually turns her life around with the very, very small changes to her lifestyle. So it's unlike things normally don't read books like this, so I was very surprised that I enjoyed this, to be honest. When I picked it up, I was going to give it a go, and I found it fantastic. So I just want to recommend it for anyone who's looking for a book for this December break. It's a nice book to read on a beach or on a hammock or just in your bed over December. Very easy to read, but a lovely story and a fantastic message behind it.
Amazing. It definitely sounds empowering of how somebody, at that young age, but doing something very different to a lot of people in just living out the sort of day-to-day rat race, getting her passion going and putting her everything into something that has clearly touched a lot of people's lives. And just on the theme of loneliness, I think it's really important. Big cities like London, New York, there's so many people, but basic human interaction is lacking in the way that you could imagine. Like you honestly are just a number here. You're just lacking that basic, and it's really interesting how in a world or in a city with so many people, some people can feel so alone, and it's so easy to feel so alone when everyone's in their own little bubbles. So yeah, I definitely think that sounds like a great read, and I would be interested to read it. So thanks, Barry. Let's look ahead. This is our piece generally on tech and movements in the world. Let's head on.
Looking ahead.
So this is actually one that we were meant to chat about last week, but obviously we had such a full agenda, we decided to pull it off. So it is a week old, but yeah, basically China due to introduce face scans for mobile users. Now, we've seen on various platforms and profiles, you mentioned it earlier in this episode, basically the phenomenon of the troll, people feeling empowered behind the face of their screen, and really just being bold and saying things they generally wouldn't. This is essentially a policy to make sure that people who post online content are who they say they are. They will have to provide face scans, which would need to match ID information provided. What do you think?
It's fascinating. It's another example of this Chinese experiment that's happening just outside of the Western world, where they're testing all sorts of new social structures and social kind of taboo topics in a very interesting way, and in a lot of cases very nefarious ways, right? So we've seen China unveil a level of facial recognition that has been unseen throughout the rest of the world, right? The amount of facial recognition in that country is crazy. From every concert, every public transport station, every public office, everywhere, there's cameras that are recording everything. And this is yet another example of them collecting even more data on their citizens, even more facial data to actually track citizens across the country, and then, as you say, to monitor their online postings. And just to remind everybody, their online world is also highly regulated and highly censored and very, very firewall intensive as well. And so it doesn't surprise me at all coming from China. I think we've seen the right amount of uproar from the rest of the world saying this is getting into dangerous territory. And the fact that you have no other option, if you want to register a SIM card, if you want to buy a new phone, you have to submit your face, and that's just how it works. And that, unfortunately, feeds the data back to the Chinese government, which then they use for all their other services as well. And so from my perspective, I think it's quite worrying. I think that it's a terrifying level of surveillance and a terrifying level of data capturing. And it's something that we're gonna have to watch and see what happens. If I was in China right now, I would feel quite hard done by. I don't know what you think, Chad.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, elsewhere in the world, we do have services where we voluntarily provide our facial data. I'm talking about the iPhone, where you have that 3D facial recognition for Face ID. But yeah, again, this is very different to government holding all of this information. And as you say, when you're in a place where there is so much firewalls on the internet space and so much, kind of cutting out in terms of even things like TV, where government really does have such an overarching channel to their people, this is, I completely agree, really, really scary. And yeah, I mean, for a country with so many people who really have no choice on the matter, it's really, really an interesting development. So yeah, terrifying for anyone who's there, but we'll certainly watch on from the other side of the world. Shall we move on?
Just one more thing before we move on. What you said has kind of triggered a thought for me. You was talking about how we voluntarily give up our face. I was reading a great article about, do you remember the app Face app? Where people were making themselves look older or look younger or making them look female or look male.
Yes, absolutely.
So that app went very viral and was like a fad for like 2 weeks or so. And it was just an example of how we just willingly give up this information. And they found out that 35 million people had used that app. So 35 million different faces have been submitted to this app. And the app owner lives in Russia. He's some dude living in Russia. And so you don't know what he's doing with that. And it's just an example of how, like, it's so easy to get people to give you their information. They don't even think about it. They're like, oh, I can look like grandpa. Yep. Cool. Sign me up. Let me send my stuff through, right? They don't read the privacy policy. They don't understand what's going on. And so it's an example of how this privacy conversation comes up again and again and again because we do stupid things with our data. And so, I just thought I'd bring that up. We speak about voluntarily sharing our faces.
Didn't know that. So yeah, I definitely saw on my profiles all of the older and younger looking friends of mine. But yeah, didn't know that that's what they were signing up for. And we spoke about this a couple of weeks back. It is certainly worrying. And I mean, something like Snapchat as well. I went to a talk that was hosted by Investec with one of the popular kind of social media lawyers, Emma Sadler in South Africa, one of the people really speaking in the space.
She's great.
And essentially, she is fantastic, yeah. And she essentially was speaking to basically how they own the pictures you put up on the platform, and that technology really being very advanced. I mean, to put a filter and completely alter your facial profile while still being cohesive, they are really mapping out all of the key patterns on your face, and you don't even have ownership of that information. So definitely interesting, and if anything, hopefully we'll get you kind of thinking about these types of things. Shall we move on?
Yeah, let's do it.
Develop and grow.
So we're at that section of the podcast where we look to ourselves and look to becoming better people, and this one really quite an interesting one. So obviously I started a new job last week, and was thrown on my first day into a wider team meeting, where they basically have this phenomenon of one good and one bad. Now it's really simple, really simplistic, nothing complicated going on here, but basically the fact for me that every single person in the team, no matter how junior, how senior, has their moment to shine and has to think about something good and has to think about something bad. For me, I just feel like it's a really organic way of flattening hierarchy. You've got top management in the room. They are listening to your problem. Ultimately, they are also rewarding you for things you did well. So I just think this is such a positive thing, such a simple thing to implement, but it gives a feeling of support to employees of all levels. It also gives the opportunity for reward. And yeah, I just thought it was such a nice thing. I've not seen it before.
Why do you think it's so powerful, Chad? Did you get the sense people were braver in what they were bringing up, or was it because they had the good and the bad that they could sandwich in their complaints or sandwich in their criticism with something positive? What do you think made it so impactful?
I don't think the word brave even came into question. People were authentically themselves. I don't think people were holding back for being polite in not voicing things that went bad. And so for me, I felt like obviously this needs to be implemented in the right way, which obviously it has in this case, where people are just genuinely interested in where managers are genuinely interested in making their employees' lives better, helping out. This is essentially a platform where, if you've got something that's really struggling, you're really struggling with something that you can't pull across the line, and instead of it kind of falling as a big burden on you, this gives you an opportunity to, amongst your peers, get the support. Somebody on your team might know how to deal with this problem, and for me, without this platform, a lot of the times we just sit in our own world, in our own feeling of negativity, don't know how to move past something, and something as simple as this opens the doors to getting that insight, getting that advice from colleagues, and ultimately getting the ears of top management in a way that I've not seen before, which I think is powerful. And I think reward and motivation is important in a workplace as well. So being able to be proud of the things that you've achieved in your week, and getting genuine sort of reward and that feeling of accomplishment from your peers and top management, I think is quite a powerful one.
Maybe also going back to our journaling conversation from a past episode, maybe that's a cool way to apply it in your own life, right? Is sitting down with that journal and for every day picking one good and one bad. Because often in journaling, we hate on ourselves, we talk about all the stuff that's going wrong, and a little bit of gratitude, a little bit of appreciation for something that's gone well in that day is also really cool. So maybe an idea is to apply it to your own life. In meetings is great, but also at home by yourself.
100%. A great approach, and something nice to add. Let's talk about the next one. One of the reasons why we're doing this podcast. I mean, I certainly, when I listen back to this, and I really do apologize if it's a thing, but I'm trying to get better at it, and that's one of the reasons. I say a lot of sort ofs, a lot of a lot of a lot of kind, I just did it. So this is something that's quite interesting, and one of the reasons why I've joined on this podcast as well. So talk us through it.
Yeah, so as you say, one of the main reasons we're doing this is to try and look at the speech that we use and get better at articulating ourselves. Yeah, so a little bit behind the scenes at the podcast here is that one of the main reasons we're doing this is to get better at public speaking and get better at articulating our thoughts in a way that doesn't have all these verbal tics that I'm sure you guys are very annoyed by. And we're annoyed by it too, right? And so when we listen back to ourselves, we cringe because we are new to this and we are getting better every week, but we are still nowhere near where we should be. And why I think this is interesting is because I've been thinking a lot about words recently. I realize that a lot of the stuff I've been reading in the last couple of weeks has been thinking about the power of words. And what's interesting for me is that the vocabulary we use is such an interesting indicator of our mood, of how we're feeling at the time, and what kind of what kind of mindset we have, right? A lot of people, if you have a very limited vocabulary, you're using certain adjectives and certain words over and over and over again, and they build these patterns and these loops in your mind that might constrain you from thinking outside the box, or might constrain you from feeling things outside of the box. And so, for example, if you only use the word "I'm fine" or "I'm good," right, and that's your standard response at all times, all of a sudden that response becomes autopilot, and you're not actually thinking carefully about how you're responding in that time. Or for example, if you're using an adjective, everything's amazing and fantastic and amazing, right? Again, you're constraining yourself in another way. And so it's just a thought that the vocabulary we use is so habitual and it means so much to us that it's worth thinking about the kinds of things that you say to yourself and to other people again and again and again, and evaluating, is that actually doing good for you? Is it actually serving you? Is it making you a better person? Or are there ways you can change that language slightly? So from "I can't do something" to "I can't do something yet," or from "I don't want to do that" to "it's not my priority right now." Or there's various interesting linguistic changes you can do. And what that comes from is just understanding, what do you say on a regular basis? What are the kind of things you say again and again and again? And trying to figure out, are there better ways to say that? And so I thought I'd bring it up because that's what we're trying to do with this podcast. So it's a bit meta here. We're trying to get better at this. But for listeners, I hope that there's something that you can take out of this as well, knowing that we all have those things that we say so often. And the words that we use, even though we don't think it at the time, have such power in directing our thoughts, our intentions, our feelings, and then our actions in the world. And so your words are your thoughts. And when you articulate themselves, they need to be powerful. They need to be empowering for you, and I need to make you a better person. I don't know what you think, Chad.
I mean, I'm just nodding my head here because I am guilty of every single one of those things. And so, I need to start reading a lot more. I definitely agree with you in that your commonly used words limit you in feeling and in thinking and in all of that kind of thing. So I certainly need to do some more reading. And this is ultimately, as you said, the reason why, my main reason for doing this, alongside being up to date with what's happening in the world and, having those deep conversations. As we said, there isn't a place for that. And in this sort of shallow society where everyone is ultimately to themselves, like we just discussed, it is good to have that place where you can have those deeper discussions. But certainly vocal speech and public speaking is one of the other reasons. And it is why, as I said in one of the previous episodes, I attribute my success in my last set of interviewing. So something as small as a couple of episodes already has made a profound impact. And certainly I think reading a few books and improving the vocabulary and basically just not getting into that autopilot, being a little bit more, placing a bit more emphasis on the thought, taking a few seconds to think about the word that you really want to say rather than just pulling it from the words that are closer. Open up that shelf and dig a little bit deeper, which is exactly what I'm trying to do as well. So thanks for bringing that up, and I'm completely guilty.
We're getting better week by week. And the fact of the matter is that the more you practice, the better you get, right? And so it's not about eliminating every by the next episode. It's about figuring out every single time, can we get a little bit better? Can we use a little bit of different words? Can we think a little bit differently? Because at the end of the day, communication is such an important skill and such an important thing, and it's powerful in this world. If you can communicate with clarity and with feeling and with intensity and can really make a message go across to another person, you can do whatever you want in this world. And whether that's written, whether that's speaking, whether that's communicating via other ways, it's fantastic. So it's worth working on.
All the way back to basics. That's kind of the theme of this episode, and it's good. I love it. So let's move on to the next one. We got a question from a listener.
What's on your mind?
So I'm going to introduce this one just because this one is aimed at Barry, and I think it's fantastic. So we have a listener who basically comments on almost every single one of our YouTube videos, and it's great to have that engaging sort of platform with listeners. So we really encourage all of you to put those comments up. If it's a quick little thought, just put it up. We love seeing it. So the question is, so this one's from somebody by the name of Dean Kennedy. If Barry feels up to it and you can fit it in, I would love to hear his take on the trolley problem. as an added twist, while also pondering if this situation is acted out in a vehicle simulator with hundreds, if not thousands, of subjects who have no prior knowledge of the experiment, what the results would be, and can these be built into an AI system? Quite a loaded question, Barry. Let's unpick this one. Go for it.
Yeah, so you're unleashing the beast here, right? So Barry always feels up to these kind of conversations. So yeah, the trolley problem is one of the fundamental questions in philosophy, and we chatted a little bit about it in the last episode when we were talking about consequentialism versus deontology, and the trolley problem is the practical implementation of that thought process, right? So just to remind ourselves, a consequentialist point of view is looking at an action is right if the consequences end up being right, no matter what happens in between, right? Whereas a deontological point of view says, no, the intentions of the action determine whether it's right or wrong, and even if there's bad consequences, if you act with good intentions, you did the right thing. So that's a quick reminder about the two thought processes. So the trolley problem goes like this. Imagine you are on a bridge, right? And there is a train barreling down the tracks, and there are two tracks the train could go onto. So it can either keep going on the track it's currently on, or you can pull a lever and make the train go onto the second pair of tracks, right? That's kind of the context. On the original track, there is, for example, 5 human beings that are tied down to the train and will die if the train keeps going over that track. Alternatively, if you switch it to the other track, there is one person on that track, right, who will die if you switch to that track. So the idea is, you as the third-party bystander, you're watching this happen, and there's only one of two options. Do you pull that lever, right? So, for example, do you pull the lever to save the 5 people and kill the one, or do you leave the lever and kill the 5 people and save the one, right? So that's how the trolley problem starts. And most people, I'm curious to think what you think, Chad. Most people will pull the lever there. Most people will say, sure, I'm going to save the 5 people, and because even though it's a tragedy that the one person dies, to save the 5 people is actually doing it for the greater good. So I'm going to pull the lever. Yep. Is that intuition correct for you?
100%, yeah.
Cool. So that's exactly what most people say. So then it takes you to another level. So then it says, cool, imagine the same situation, but instead of a lever this time, the train is barreling down the tracks towards the 5 people, and you're standing on a bridge above the tracks, right? And there's a fat man standing next to you. And you have a choice to push the fat man off the bridge onto the track and stop the train to save the 5. Right, so theoretically now, it's the same thing. You are killing the one to save the 5. But when you ask people if they're going to push the fat man off the bridge, all of a sudden the intuitions change a lot, and there's a much more 50-50 split between the people who say I can't do that, right? And so what would you do, Chad?
To be honest, I don't know. I'm now stuck. I'm stuck, Barry. Hopefully this train can slow down.
That's exactly it, right? It even though the actual context is exactly the same, the calculation is exactly the same. The mere fact of changing, me pulling a lever, which is kind of detached from the whole situation, I'm just playing God and I'm making a decision. All of a sudden now I have to actually physically push someone off a bridge, and all of a sudden it feels very, very different. And so what the trolley problem does, it then goes into there's 1,000 different variations of this kind of thing. There's 20, and then there's 10, and then you're pushing a guy and you're pulling there's like 1,000 of these variations. What the problem tries to show you is that our intuitions about what is right and what is wrong are very messy, and people do not agree on them, right? So when you ask these questions to like a mass audience, you'll often find a 50-50 split or a 60-40 split, and you'll be surprised by the number of people who disagree with your intuition on whatever situation is in front of you. And so what the trolley problem shows, again, is that if we're going to try and decide on a complete set of ethics that we're going to program into a self-driving car, we're not going to agree. Right? We're not going to find a set of ethics because this becomes very, very real with a self-driving car, right? If you imagine a self-driving car situation barreling down a highway and there's an accident up front and he can't stop, does he swerve out of the way into oncoming traffic and destroy the car in that lane, or does it stay in this lane and destroy the car in front of it, right? So that's a very real trolley problem that we're going to face in the coming years. And so I think the question that Dean is kind of bringing up, I hope I'm doing it justice, but I think the question he's bringing up is that this kind of discussion is very difficult to program because we don't have consensus. we don't have an algorithm or an understanding of what an ethical framework looks like that everyone can agree with. Everyone's ethics depend on their upbringing, the way they think, the way they were educated, where they were born, and 1,000 different factors. And so for a car company to decide how we're going to interact with this real-life trolley problem is very, very difficult. And it's one of those things where we're not going to know how to deal with it until we actually get there. And for the philosophers, it's fascinating because this has been a thought experiment for decades, right? And all of a sudden it's becoming very, very real. And a lot of their thinking and their thought processes are starting to be tested in the real world. The last part of his question was thinking about, let me just read it here. If it's acted out in a vehicle simulator with hundreds, if not thousands of subjects who had no prior knowledge of the experiment, what would the results be? Yeah. And this has actually happened. So there was a research organization that did an online survey that didn't talk at all about the trolley problem. It didn't include any of the philosophy. It didn't do any of that. It simply had an interactive web app where people would go on and play this game. So they give you that game with the fat man and the five on the tracks, and people would vote on whatever they would do. And they did thousands of these variations, and the thing went very viral, and so they got, I think, 200,000 responses. Obviously looking for the trends in the marketplace and the trends from real people who don't understand it's a psychological thought experiment and they just think it's like a cool game or whatever the story is. And those results were very interesting because they bared out what we thought, is that there is no consensus. There's a complete range of thoughts across the board, and even on these very even on the first question I asked you, where there's a high probability you're going to pull the lever, there's still a significant non-negligible portion that are not going to pull the lever because they want no part of it at all. They just want to leave it completely. And so it was a very interesting experiment and a very interesting realization that we are nowhere near consensus. If we're going to try and decide what as a world we're going to put into these cars, we actually have got no idea at this stage. And that is scary because it's coming, the technology is on the way, and real-life philosophy is going to have to be in play. But if we can't agree on anything, then I don't know how we're going to move forward. So that's kind of, if I had to try and answer the 3 parts, I hope it did it justice, Dean. Chad, do you have any other thoughts or comments?
I mean, being a person who's looking on this completely cold, I think you articulated it perfectly. So I definitely understand the massive problem that this is. And yeah, it's a fascinating one to see where you sit on it. I certainly think if Trump was playing this game and he was the one and the Congress people were the 5, I think I know what he would do. But yeah, thanks for answering that question. And Dean, thanks for asking it. The show isn't what it is without our listeners. And yeah, we definitely appreciate the questions. So yeah, great question and great answer. Thanks, Barry. So yeah, I mean, I think that brings us to the end of our podcast. As I said, they all try to stop us today, but it just didn't happen. We had to soldier on, and hopefully we produced something that you enjoyed listening to. Yeah, I mean, our representation around the globe has grown even more. So this last week, I had a little look on our stats, and we're now in Sweden and Australia as well.
Amazing. It's so cool to see it growing and so cool to see everyone from around the world joining in. We really appreciate all the kind words and the kind comments. As Chad says, we're going to do our utmost to do this every single week. No matter what ESCOM throws at us, no matter what the tube throws at us, we're going to get the job done because we really enjoy it and we really enjoy hearing from you guys as well. And so we'd love to hear your thoughts on the episode, thoughts on where we could improve. We're always trying to make this better, so please let us know where we can improve. And as always, if you have any questions via voice note or via text, please send them through to us. We'd love to chat and hear what your thoughts are on these various topics we're discussing.
Awesome. Well, yeah, as always, Barry, it's been a pleasure. Would you like to throw us off with the final jingle?
Sure thing. You have listened to Across the Pond, episode 5. We'll see you next week. Have a good one.
Pond, across the pond with Barry and Chad.
None of our vocal acrobatics today. Hope to facilitate at all costs. Absolutely. So yeah, we're back. Oh, sorry. Podcast, but I think a lot of our focus is on the let's start that again. Of data that it's not a deep.
And so I think it's kind of cosmetic because the current CEO Sundar Pichai, what's his name?
I think we should cut that.
Yeah, please. This change is mostly cosmetic because for a long time now, the current CEO, Sundar... Brr. Sundar Pichai. Sundar Pichai. Okay.
Okay. Cool.
Okay. This change, though, is probably a little bit cosmetic because for the last couple of years, the current CEO Sundar Pichai. God.
This is what happens when you record a podcast at 10 p.m. everyone.
I don't know what's so funny. I agree with the. I don't know if I agree with the message.
I think it's interesting. I think you basically. Sorry.
Chad.
Absolutely. I mean, here, kind of elsewhere in the world, we do have services where we. Sorry, let me start again. Gives. Sorry, but it.
I don't know.
I definitely understand the sort of the. Sorry. Would you like to throw us off with the final jingle?
Sure. What is the final thing?